The next morning, I walked back to the house at exactly 9 a.m., the same house my son had locked me out of just hours before, and for a moment I stood there, looking at the front door like a stranger might, except I wasn't a stranger. I was the legal owner, the only name on the deed, the only person who had never signed anything away. When Michael opened the door, his expression shifted from irritation to confusion to something dangerously close to panic the second he saw who stood behind me, because I hadn't come back alone, and Vanessa's smile froze the instant she noticed the man beside me adjusting his briefcase. Mr. Robert Klein, the attorney my late husband had trusted for over 30 years. "What is this?" Michael asked, trying to sound in control, but his voice cracked at the edges, and I stepped forward without asking permission, crossing the threshold he had tried to deny me the night before, feeling the quiet weight of the moment settle into my bones. "This," I said calmly, "is me taking my house back," and Mr. Klein didn't waste time. He laid the documents out on the dining table, the same table I had polished every Sunday for decades, and began speaking in a tone so precise it cut through every lie they had built, explaining how the so-called insurance update Vanessa had pushed me to sign months ago was, in fact, an attempted fraudulent transfer, one that had already been flagged, documented, and reported. Vanessa's face drained of color as he continued, outlining the evidence: emails, forged signatures, bank transfers rerouted under her instruction, and Michael turned to her slowly, like a man realizing the ground beneath him wasn't solid at all. "You told me it was all legal," he whispered, but she couldn't answer because there was no lie left that could stand under the weight of proof. Mr. Klein then placed a second document in front of them, one I had authorized the moment I spent that cold night outside. A legal notice of eviction, effective immediately, along with a formal complaint filed for attempted fraud and financial exploitation, and that was the moment everything broke. Vanessa lunged into excuses, into blame, into desperation, but the law didn't bend for her theatrics, and Michael, my son, stood there silent, realizing too late that the house he thought he had claimed was never his to take. "You locked me out," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "So I let you believe you'd won for one night." And I watched the understanding hit him like a final blow. Officers arrived within the hour, not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable. And as Vanessa was escorted out, still trying to twist her story into something salvageable, Michael didn't resist, didn't argue. He just looked at me, hollow and stunned, as if seeing me for the first time not as someone he could dismiss, but as someone he had completely underestimated. By noon, the house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but restored, and I walked through each room slowly, reclaiming not just the space, but the dignity they thought they had stripped from me. I changed the locks myself that afternoon, each click final, deliberate, earned, and when I stood in the doorway that evening, the same doorway they had shut in my face, I didn't feel anger anymore, only clarity. They hadn't taken anything from me. They had exposed themselves, and in doing so they had lost everything. I stepped inside, closed the door, and this time it was mine alone to lock. My son locked me out of my own house at exactly 10:17 p.m., and the only thing I said was, "All right," before I turned around and walked away. I didn't argue. I didn't knock again. I didn't even raise my voice. The porch light behind me flicked off as I stepped into the cold, like a quiet signal that whatever life I thought I still had inside that house was officially over. I remember the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, slow, deliberate, final. It echoed louder than it should have. Maybe because I knew it wasn't just a door being locked. It was my son choosing a side. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 72 years old, and that house, the one I was just shut out of, isn't just any house. It's the house my late husband and I bought 41 years ago, back when interest rates were high and money was tight, but we believed in building something that would last. Every inch of that place carries a memory. The kitchen where I cooked thousands of meals. The hallway where my son Michael took his first steps. The living room where my husband sat every evening, reading the paper like clockwork. And now, apparently, none of it belonged to me anymore. At least, that's what they wanted me to believe. When Michael opened that door earlier that night, he didn't look angry. That would have been easier to understand. No, he looked certain. Like someone who had already convinced himself he was doing the right thing. Vanessa stood just behind him, arms crossed, her expression calm in that way that always made me uneasy. "Mom, you should have told us you were coming back tonight," Michael said, like I was the one interrupting something. I blinked at him, confused. "This is my home," I replied. My voice didn't shake. I made sure of that. Vanessa let out a small, humorless laugh. It's complicated now, she said. Complicated. That word again. It had been showing up more and more over the past few months. Complicated finances. Complicated arrangements. Complicated decisions that somehow never included me. I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for something familiar in his face. The boy who used to run to me after school, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. But that boy wasn't standing in front of me anymore. This was a man who couldn't meet my eyes. We think it's best if you stay somewhere else tonight, he said quietly. Somewhere else. Like I was a guest. Like I didn't have a key in my purse. Like I hadn't spent 4 decades paying every bill tied to that address. I reached for the handle anyway. Not forcefully. Just enough to remind him that I still could. That's when he stepped forward and closed the door. Not slammed. Just closed it. And then came the lock. Click. I stood there for a second, staring at the wood grain of the door I had chosen myself all those years ago. I could have argued. I could have demanded answers. But something in me shifted instead. Something quiet. Something cold. All right, I said again, more to myself this time. Then I turned around and walked down the driveway. They thought that was the moment they took everything from me. They were wrong. That was the moment I decided to let them think they had. I did not drive far that night. There was no reason to. The streets I passed were the same ones I had known for decades. Quiet suburban roads lined with maple trees and identical mailboxes. The kind of place where people waved at each other in the mornings and left their porch lights on a little too long. I ended up in the parking lot of a small park just 3 blocks away. The same park where Michael used to play Little League on Saturday mornings. I turned off the engine and sat there, my hand still resting on the steering wheel, listening to the soft ticking sound of the car cooling down. It was colder than I expected for early fall, somewhere in the low 50s, and I could feel it seeping through the glass. I had left in such a hurry that I had not even thought to grab a coat. For a moment I considered going back, knocking again, insisting. But the image of that door closing replayed in my mind, and I knew I would not be doing that. Not tonight. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes, letting the silence settle around me. It was a different kind of quiet than the one inside my house. That quiet used to feel warm, familiar, filled with small sounds that meant life was still moving forward. This quiet felt empty, like something had been stripped away. I told myself it was just one night, just a few hours until morning. I could handle that. I had handled far worse in my life without making a scene. Still, there was something about sitting alone in that car, parked in a place that used to hold so many good memories, that made everything feel sharper. I opened the glove compartment and found an old blanket folded in the back, something I kept for long drives. It smelled faintly of laundry detergent and thyme. I wrapped it around my shoulders and looked out at the dark field beyond the windshield. The baseball diamond was barely visible under the dim park lights, but I could still picture it clearly. Michael at 8 years old, running toward first base with his helmet slightly too big for his head, turning back to make sure I was watching. I had always been watching. I had always been there. And now somehow I was the one left outside. I reached for my purse and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, but to check something that had been bothering me for weeks. There had been small changes, subtle at first. Bills arriving later than usual. Statements that did not quite match what I remembered. Vanessa offering to help with paperwork more often than necessary. At the time I had brushed it off. Families evolve. Roles shift. That was what I told myself. But sitting there in the cold, replaying the last few months, those small details began to line up in a way they never had before. The conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The way Michael avoided direct answers when I asked about finances. The day Vanessa insisted I sign a set of documents quickly because they were time-sensitive. I had not thought much of it then. I trusted them. Why would I not? Now that memory felt different. Heavier. Like a piece of a puzzle I had been too comfortable to solve. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through my emails, searching for anything that might explain what had just happened. It did not take long to find it. A message from a law office I recognized but had not contacted in years. The subject line was simple. It was my husband's name. My chest tightened slightly as I stared at it. I had meant to open it when it arrived. I remembered seeing it, thinking I would deal with it later. later had come and gone. Until now. I tapped the screen and began to read. The glow of the phone lighting up the car as the truth started to take shape in front of me. I read the message twice before I fully understood what it was saying, and even then I did not react the way most people would expect, because shock does not always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, settling into your chest like a weight you cannot yet measure. The email was from Robert Klein, my husband's attorney, a man I had not spoken to since the funeral 3 years ago, and the words were formal, careful, unmistakably precise, informing me that certain documents related to my husband's estate had recently been flagged for review due to irregularities in authorization and execution, and that I should contact his office as soon as possible to clarify my intent regarding any recent transfers. I stared at the screen, my fingers still, my breathing slow, because in that moment, something shifted from confusion into clarity, not complete clarity, but enough to understand that what happened at that door was not sudden. It was planned, layered, built over time while I was still setting the table and, believing we were a family, I scrolled further down the message and saw attachments, copies of documents that bore my name, my signature, and yet something about them felt wrong, not obviously wrong, not in a way that would alarm someone glancing quickly, but wrong in the way a familiar voice sounds when it is slightly off, like someone trying to imitate something they do not fully understand. I opened one of the files and looked at the signature line, and there it was, my name written in a way that resembled mine but lacked the small details only I would know, the pressure of the pen, the slight curve in the last letter, the rhythm that comes from years of signing the same way. I did not gasp, I did not cry, I simply leaned back in my seat and let the truth settle in, piece by piece, aligning with every uneasy feeling I had ignored over the past few months. Vanessa insisting on handling paperwork, saying it was easier that way, Michael telling me not to worry about the details, because they had it under control, the way they would exchange quick looks when I asked simple questions, as if I had stepped into a conversation I was not meant to hear. It was all there now, no longer scattered, no longer harmless but connected, intentional. I thought about the night they asked me to sign those documents at the kitchen counter, how Vanessa had placed them in front of me with a polite smile, how she had said it was just an update, nothing complicated, how Michael had stood beside her, quiet, waiting, and how I had trusted them enough not to read every line carefully, because that is what you do when you believe the people in front of you would never put you in a position to lose everything. I exhaled slowly and looked out at the empty park again, the field still, the lights dim, and for the first time since the door closed behind me, I did not feel displaced, I felt awake. They had not just locked me out of a house, they had tried to remove me from something much larger, something that required planning, signatures, coordination, and the assumption that I would never question it. My phone screen dimmed, and I tapped it again, reading the final line of the email, the one that mattered most, the one that confirmed what I already knew but needed to see written clearly, stating that according to all original records, no valid transfer of ownership had been completed, and that any attempt to do so without proper authorization would be considered legally void and subject to investigation. I let that sentence sit with me, steady and quiet, and then I nodded once to myself, not in relief, not yet, but in understanding, because whatever they believed they had taken from me was still mine. And more importantly, whatever they had done to try and take it had just given me something far more valuable than anger. It had given me leverage. I did not start the car right away after reading that message because once you understand something at that level, there is no rushing past it. There is only sitting with it long enough to let every detail settle into place. I placed the phone face down on my lap and looked out through the windshield again, but I was no longer seeing the park, I was seeing my kitchen, my dining table, the exact spot where those documents had been laid out in front of me weeks ago. And for the first time I replayed that moment without the filter of trust. Vanessa had been standing slightly to my left, angled just enough to watch my hand as I signed, while Michael stood across from me, not speaking, not explaining, just present, and at the time I thought it was support, now I understood it was confirmation. They needed me to sign, and they needed me to do it without hesitation. I remember asking a simple question, something about whether I should keep a copy, and Vanessa had smiled in that polished way of hers and said she would handle everything, that she would organize the paperwork and make sure it was filed properly, and I had nodded because that is what I had been doing for months, stepping back, letting them take over small responsibilities that slowly became larger ones, convincing myself it was normal, that families evolve, that children grow into roles and parents step aside. But sitting there now I could see the pattern clearly, not as a series of isolated moments but as a deliberate progression, each step designed to make the next one easier, each small shift building towards something much bigger. I thought about the way Vanessa would refer to the house as our place instead of your house, how she would casually mention renovations or changes without asking, how Michael stopped correcting her, stopped reinforcing the truth, and instead adopted her language, her tone, her certainty. It had not happened overnight, and that was the part that mattered most, because nothing that unfolds slowly ever feels like a threat until it is already too late to ignore. I reached for my phone again and opened the attachments one more time, this time not to question them but to study them, to understand exactly what they had tried to do, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that clarity is more powerful than reaction. The documents outlined a transfer that had never been completed, a process that required more than just my signature, more than just timing and convenience, and that was where they had miscalculated. They assumed I would remain exactly who I had been, someone who trusted, someone who did not question, someone who would accept what she was told without looking deeper. I let out a slow breath and adjusted the blanket around my shoulders, feeling the cold more sharply now, but also feeling something else rise in its place, something steady, something controlled. I was not outside that house because I had lost it. I was outside because they needed me to believe I had, and for one night I was willing to let them believe their version of the story was real. I picked up my phone and scrolled back to the top of the email, finding the contact number listed beneath Robert Klein's name, and I stared at it for a moment before pressing call, because there are moments in life where everything shifts not because of what is taken from you, but because of what you choose to do next, and as the line began to ring, I knew this was one of those moments. I listened to the ringing on the other end of the line without shifting in my seat, counting each second not with impatience, but with a quiet sense of inevitability, because by the time someone like Robert Klein picks up a call at nearly 11 at night, it means the situation has already crossed a line that cannot be ignored. When his voice finally came through, calm and steady, I introduced myself without hesitation, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in, followed by a tone that changed almost immediately, becoming more attentive, more direct. I did not explain everything at once, I did not rush through details or let emotion lead the conversation. Instead I told him exactly what had happened that night, the door, the lock, the words that were said and the ones that were not, and then I asked him a single question, one that mattered more than anything else in that moment, whether there had been any legitimate transfer of ownership connected to my name. The silence that followed was not uncertainty, it was calculation, and when he responded, his answer was as clear as the air outside my car. No, there had not been, not legally, not in any way that would stand under scrutiny, and more importantly, he confirmed what the email had already suggested, that there had been an attempt, one that was incomplete, one that raised concerns serious enough for his office to flag and investigate. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of relief but out of acknowledgement, because hearing it spoken carried a different weight than reading it on a screen. It made everything real in a way that could not be dismissed or softened. He asked me if I was safe, if I had somewhere to stay, and I answered honestly, telling him I was in my car just a few blocks away, and that I would manage the night because that was not the part that needed solving right now. What mattered was what came next, and he understood that without me needing to say it directly. His voice lowered slightly as he explained the situation from a legal standpoint, how any document signed under misleading circumstances could be challenged, how unauthorized attempts to redirect assets could carry consequences beyond simple correction, how the details I had described aligned with patterns he had seen before, patterns that never ended well for the people who thought they were being careful. I listened without interrupting, letting each word settle into place, building not just understanding but direction. He told me to come to his office first thing in the morning, that he would prepare everything necessary to secure my position, to document what had happened, to ensure that no further attempts could be made without immediate consequence, and I agreed without hesitation. Because for the first time since that door closed, there was a clear path forward. Before ending the call he paused, and in that pause there was something more than professionalism. There was a kind of quiet respect, the kind that comes when someone realizes you are not reacting, you are responding, and he said something simple, something that stayed with me even after the line went silent, that I had done the right thing by not escalating, that patience in moments like this often reveals more than confrontation ever could. I lowered the phone slowly and set it back in my lap, the screen fading to black as the night pressed in around me, but it no longer felt empty, it felt like space, like distance that had been created on purpose, and I understood then that this was not a night of loss, it was a night of separation, a line drawn between what they believed and what was actually true, and as I adjusted the blanket around my shoulders and looked out at the quiet field once more, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, because by morning, everything they thought they had secured would begin to unravel, and they would not see it coming until it was already too late. The night stretched longer than I expected, not because of the cold or the discomfort, but because once your mind starts connecting pieces you had ignored for too long, it does not stop just because the clock moves forward. I do not think I slept more than a few minutes at a time, just brief moments where my eyes closed and opened again to the same dim light and quiet surroundings. But I did not feel exhausted, I felt focused, as if something inside me had shifted into a place it had not been in years. When the first hint of morning began to lighten the sky, I sat up straighter in the driver's seat and took a slow breath, noticing how the air felt different, not warmer but clearer, like the night had served its purpose and there was nothing left to wait for. I folded the blanket carefully and placed it back where I had found it, a small, deliberate action that grounded me in the moment. And then I reached for my phone again, checking the time, just after 6:30, early enough that most people would still be asleep, but not early enough to change what was about to happen. I imagined the house at that exact moment, the one just a few blocks away, picturing Michael waking up in the bedroom he had claimed as his own, Vanessa moving through the kitchen as if it had always belonged to her, their routines continuing without interruption, without consequence, because as far as they knew, nothing had changed except that I was no longer there. That was the part that mattered most, the fact that they believed the situation was settled, that the door closing behind me had ended something permanently, and I understood now how valuable that belief was, because it meant they would not be careful, they would not question, they would continue exactly as they had been, and that gave me the advantage I needed. I started the engine and let it idle for a moment, watching the condensation fade from the windshield as the heater slowly came to life. And in that quiet space, I went over everything Robert had said the night before, not as instructions, but as confirmation of what I already knew I had to do. This was not about confrontation, it was not about standing on that porch and demanding explanations, it was about timing, documentation, and control, and those things required patience more than anything else. I drove out of the parking lot slowly, taking the familiar turns that led away from the park and toward the main road, passing houses that looked unchanged, people beginning their morning routines, a world that had no idea how much had shifted in the span of a single night. I did not look toward my street as I passed the intersection that would have taken me there. I kept driving, because going back too soon would have been a mistake, and I was not going to make any more mistakes based on emotion. Instead, I headed toward the office Robert had mentioned, arriving earlier than necessary, but not wanting to risk being late, because this was the kind of morning where every detail mattered. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, the engine off now, the silence returning in a different form, one that felt less empty and more intentional, and I looked at the building ahead, a place I had only visited a handful of times in my life, always under circumstances that felt distant, administrative, something to be handled and then set aside. Today was different. Today I was not there to process something that had already happened, I was there to shape what would happen next. I reached for my purse, checked that everything I needed was in place, and then opened the car door, stepping out into the cool morning air with a steadiness I had not felt in a long time, because whatever they believed they had secured inside that house was about to be challenged in a way they had not prepared for, and for the first time since the door closed, I was not outside anything, I was exactly where I needed to be. I pushed open the glass door to Robert Klein's office at exactly 7:58 in the morning, 2 minutes before we had agreed to meet, because I had spent my entire life being on time, being prepared, being the one who handled things quietly before they became problems, and today was no different except for the fact that I finally understood just how much had been happening behind my back. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her expression polite but slightly surprised to see someone arrive so early, and I gave my name without hesitation, my voice steady, my posture straight, not as someone asking for help, but as someone stepping into a situation that required clarity. Within seconds, she nodded and gestured toward a hallway, explaining that Mr. Klein was already expecting me, and as I walked down that hallway, I noticed how familiar the place felt despite the years that had passed, the same muted colors, the same quiet professionalism, the same sense that everything discussed within those walls carried weight. When I entered his office, Robert stood up immediately, extending his hand, his expression serious but not alarmed, the kind of look that told me he had already reviewed more than I knew, and he did not waste time with small talk. Instead, he motioned for me to sit and placed a folder on the desk between us, one that was already open, already prepared, already filled with documents that had my name on them. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, listening as he began to explain what his office had uncovered. Not in vague terms, but in exact detail, outlining how the documents I had signed had been altered in ways that would not hold up under legal review, how certain sections had been added or modified after the fact, how the process required additional authorization that had never been completed, and how those discrepancies had triggered an internal review that led directly to the email I had read the night before. I did not interrupt him, I did not ask questions right away, because I wanted to hear everything first to understand the full scope of what had been attempted, not just the parts that affected me emotionally, but the parts that would matter in a courtroom, in documentation, in a setting where truth is measured by evidence rather than intention. He slid one of the documents closer to me, pointing to specific sections where inconsistencies were visible, subtle differences that would go unnoticed by someone who trusted the process, but stood out clearly to someone trained to look for them, and I leaned forward slightly, studying the paper not with disbelief, but with recognition, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. He then outlined the steps we would take next, not as suggestions but as a structured plan, beginning with securing all original records, filing a formal notice to prevent any further attempts at transfer, and documenting the events of the previous night as part of a broader pattern of behavior that indicated intent, not misunderstanding. I nodded slowly, taking in each point, understanding that this was not about reacting to what had already happened. It was about controlling what would happen from this moment forward. At one point, he paused and looked directly at me, asking a question that was simple but carried weight, whether I intended to return to the house immediately, and I shook my head without hesitation, because I already knew the answer. Returning too soon would give them time to adjust, to prepare, to create explanations, and that was not something I was willing to allow. Instead, I told him I would wait, just long enough for them to believe everything was still under their control, just long enough for their confidence to settle into routine, because that was when mistakes happened, when people stopped being careful. He nodded in agreement as if he had expected that answer, and then he closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, signaling that the preparation phase was complete and that everything from this point on would be execution. I stood up a moment later, feeling a calm I had not felt in a long time, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally understood. And as I walked out of that office, the morning light brighter now, the world fully awake around me, I realized that the distance between me and that house was no longer measured in blocks or streets. It was measured in time, and very soon that distance would disappear entirely, not because I forced my way back in, but because I would walk back in with something they could not deny, something they could not argue with, something they had already underestimated from the very beginning. By the time I stepped out of Robert's office, the day had fully settled into motion, but I did not rush back toward anything, because rushing is what people do when they are trying to catch up, and I was no longer catching up. I was moving ahead. I drove slowly through familiar streets, not toward my house, but toward a small cafe a few miles away, a place I used to visit years ago with my husband on quiet Saturday mornings, and I chose it deliberately, not for comfort but for distance, because I needed space to think clearly without the weight of what that house represented pressing in on me. I ordered a simple cup of coffee and sat by the window, placing my purse neatly beside me, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, because from the outside, nothing about me needed to suggest that anything unusual had happened at all. I watched people pass by, going about their routines, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in my life over the last 12 hours, and I realized something important in that moment, something that shaped everything that followed, which was that control is not taken back in loud, dramatic gestures. It is rebuilt in quiet, deliberate steps that no one sees until it is already complete. I took out my phone and reviewed the documents Robert had forwarded to me, not with urgency, but with precision, reading each line carefully, understanding not just what they said, but what they prevented, how each clause created a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence, and how those boundaries would soon become very real for the people who thought they had already secured their position. I also reviewed my own records, messages, emails, small details I had overlooked before, and as I did, the pattern became even clearer, not just a single attempt, but a series of actions designed to shift control gradually, to make me step back without realizing how far I had moved. I did not feel anger as I saw it more clearly. I felt something steadier than that, something more useful, because anger clouds judgment, and I needed clarity more than anything else. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed softly on the table, and I glanced at the screen to see Michael's name appear, a single missed call followed by a short message asking where I was and if everything was all right, and I studied those words for a moment, not for what they said but for what they assumed, because there was no mention of the door, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a casual concern that felt more like an obligation than anything genuine. I did not respond right away. I let the message sit there, unread in his mind, even though I had seen every word, because timing mattered now in a way it had not before, and responding too quickly would only give them time to adjust, to prepare, to shape a version of events that suited them. Instead, I placed the phone face down and took another slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in as I made a decision that felt both simple and significant, which was that I would not return until everything was in place, until every document was secured, every step prepared, and every assumption they were making had been allowed to solidify into something they believed was permanent. Because when people believe they have already won, they stop being careful, they stop questioning, and that is when the truth has the clearest path to reveal itself. I finished my coffee slowly, not because I needed the time, but because I was choosing it, choosing each moment deliberately, and when I finally stood up and walked out into the late morning light, I did so with the quiet understanding that everything from this point forward was no longer about reacting to what they had done. It was about ensuring that when I walked back into that house, it would not just be as someone returning, it would be as someone who had already taken everything back before they even realized it was gone. I did not go home that afternoon, and I did not call back right away, because by then I understood that silence was no longer weakness, it was leverage, and the longer I allowed that silence to sit between us, the more it would begin to work in my favor. I spent the next few hours exactly as I needed to, not wandering, not hesitating, but following through on each step Robert had outlined, meeting briefly with his assistant to finalize the paperwork, signing documents that secured my position in ways they could not reverse, and watching as each signature I placed carried a different kind of weight than the one they had tried to take from me, because this time I was not being guided, I was in control. By early afternoon, everything that needed to be filed had been filed, everything that needed to be documented had been documented, and the structure we had built was no longer theoretical, it was active, enforceable, and waiting. I stepped outside into the warm light of the day and checked my phone again, seeing 2 more missed calls and another message from Michael, this one slightly longer, slightly less composed, asking me to come back so they could talk, saying there must have been a misunderstanding, and I read those words carefully, not with emotion but with recognition, because this was exactly what I had expected. The shift from certainty to confusion, from control to doubt, and I knew that if I responded now, if I allowed the conversation to happen on their terms, I would be stepping back into the role they needed me to play. Instead, I took a slow breath and opened a new message, typing carefully, choosing each word with intention, because this would be the first move they would actually see. I did not accuse, I did not explain, I did not reveal anything they were not ready to hear. I simply wrote that I would come by the next day, that I had some things to take care of first, and that we could talk then, nothing more, nothing less. I read the message once before sending it, making sure the tone was exactly what it needed to be, calm, neutral, almost compliant, because the most effective position I could take right now was the one they already believed I was in. When I pressed send, I did not feel relief, I felt precision, because that single message did more than respond. It set a timeline. It gave them just enough reassurance to settle back into their assumptions, to believe that whatever had happened the night before could still be managed, still be explained away, still be controlled. I imagined them reading it, Vanessa analyzing the wording, Michael convincing himself that everything would smooth over once I returned, that whatever tension had been created would fade with a simple conversation, and that belief was exactly what I needed them to hold on to. I put my phone away and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the day settle around me, knowing that everything was now in place, not in a rushed or chaotic way, but in a deliberate, structured way that left no gaps for them to exploit. I was not going back to reclaim anything in the moment, I was going back to finalize something that had already been decided, and the difference between those two things was everything. As I walked to my car, I felt a calm certainty settle in, not the kind that comes from hope, but the kind that comes from preparation, and I understood that by the time I stepped through that door again, the outcome would no longer be uncertain, it would simply be revealed, and they would not realize what had changed until it was already too late to undo it. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet clarity that only comes after a decision has already been made, and I did not rush through it. I followed my routine as I always had, slow, deliberate, grounded in habits that had carried me through far more than a single night outside my own door. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple but composed, not for them but for myself, because presentation is not about impressing others, it is about reminding yourself exactly who you are before you step into a situation that will try to redefine you. By the time I got into my car, the sun was already high enough to cast clean shadows across the street, and as I drove toward the house, I did not feel hesitation, I felt alignment, as if every piece had settled into its place and all that remained was to let it unfold. When I turned onto my street, nothing looked different from the outside, the same trimmed lawns, the same quiet stillness of a weekday morning, and for a brief second it would have been easy to believe that nothing had changed, but I knew better, because change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly until the moment it reveals everything at once. I parked in front of the house and sat there for a second, not gathering courage but acknowledging the moment, and then I stepped out, walked up the familiar path and rang the doorbell instead of using my key, because this time, I wanted them to open the door themselves. It did not take long, and when Michael appeared, his expression was exactly what I expected, a mix of relief and uncertainty, as if he had spent the night convincing himself that everything could still be smoothed over, that whatever had happened could be explained away with the right words. Vanessa stood just behind him again, composed as always, but there was something different in her eyes now, something sharper, more watchful, because she was trying to read the situation, trying to understand what I knew and what I did not. I stepped inside without waiting to be invited, not forcefully, just naturally, as if that threshold had never been in question, and I noticed how both of them shifted slightly, not stepping back but adjusting, reacting to something they could not quite define. "We need to talk," Michael said, his voice careful, controlled, and I nodded once, setting my purse down on the same table where those documents had once been placed in front of me. I did not sit right away. I let the silence stretch just enough to unsettle the rhythm they were expecting, and then I spoke, not with accusation, not with emotion, but with a calm that carried more weight than either of those things. I told them that I had taken the time to review everything, that I had spoken with the appropriate people, and that there were certain matters that needed to be clarified before anything else could be discussed. Vanessa tried to interject, her tone measured, offering explanations before I had even asked questions, but I raised my hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to pause her, and that small gesture was all it took to shift the dynamic in the room, because it made something clear that had not been clear before, that this conversation was no longer something they could steer. I then reached into my purse and placed a folder on the table, the same kind of folder Robert had closed the day before, and I opened it, slowly, revealing documents that were no longer suggestions or possibilities, but statements, formal, structured, and undeniable. I did not explain them all at once, I did not need to, because the moment Michael saw the first page, the moment Vanessa leaned in just enough to read the heading, the understanding began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to shift the air in the room. I let that moment settle, watching them process what was in front of them, and I realized that this was the point where everything began to turn, not because I was forcing it, but because the truth, once placed directly in front of someone, has a way of unfolding on its own, and no matter how carefully they had planned, no matter how certain they had been the night before, they were now standing in a moment they had not prepared for, and there was no way for them to step around it. I did not rush to fill the silence after placing the documents on the table, because silence has a way of forcing people to reveal more than words ever could, and in that moment, both of them were already telling me everything I needed to know without saying a single thing. Michael's eyes moved quickly across the page, not reading line by line, but searching for something familiar, something he could hold on to, while Vanessa leaned in closer, her composure tightening just slightly, the kind of subtle shift that only happens when someone realizes they are no longer in control of the situation. "What is this?" Michael finally asked, his voice lower now, less certain than before, and I met his gaze without hesitation, letting the answer sit there for a second before I spoke, because timing mattered even in something as simple as a reply. I told him it was a formal clarification of ownership, a confirmation of records, and documentation of recent irregularities that had already been reviewed by legal counsel, and I watched as the meaning of those words began to settle in, not all at once but piece by piece. Vanessa straightened slightly, her tone shifting into something more assertive as she tried to step back into control, saying there must be some misunderstanding, that everything had been handled properly, that the documents I signed were standard, routine, nothing unusual, But there was a difference now, a small but undeniable one, because for the first time, her words were not being accepted at face value. They were being measured against something solid. I reached forward and turned one of the pages toward them, pointing not dramatically, just precisely, to a section that outlined the inconsistencies, the alterations, the missing authorizations, and I did not need to explain it in detail, because the language spoke clearly enough on its own. Michael's expression changed again, not into anger, but into something more difficult to hold, something closer to realization. And he looked at Vanessa in a way he had not the night before, not as someone standing beside him, but as someone he needed answers from. She began to respond quickly, her words coming faster now, layered with explanations that tried to reframe the situation, to minimize it, to suggest that any discrepancies were minor, procedural, nothing that could not be corrected. But the more she spoke, the more it became clear that she was not clarifying anything. She was reacting. I let her finish without interruption because interrupting would have given her an anchor, something to push against, and instead I waited until she stopped, until the room settled again. And then I spoke once more, calmly, evenly, stating that the matter had already moved beyond internal discussion, that it had been formally documented, and that any further action would proceed according to the process already in place. Michael's shoulders dropped slightly at that, not in defeat, but in the kind of quiet recognition that comes when a situation can no longer be managed through conversation alone, and he looked at me again, this time with something closer to understanding, though it was too late for that to change anything. Vanessa did not respond immediately, and that silence from her was louder than anything she had said before, because it marked the moment where control had fully shifted, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or accusations, but in a steady, undeniable way that left no space for negotiation. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back in front of me, not as a gesture of finality, but as a signal that everything that needed to be presented had already been presented, and that from this point forward the outcome was no longer something to be argued, it was something that would simply unfold, with or without their agreement. The silence that followed did not last long because the truth, once introduced, has a way of accelerating everything around it, and within minutes, the final pieces of what I had set in motion began to arrive exactly as planned. There was a firm knock at the door, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate, and I watched as Michael turned toward it instinctively, his expression already tightening, as if some part of him understood what was coming even before he opened it. When he did, the presence on the other side shifted the entire atmosphere of the room without a single raised voice, because authority does not need to announce itself loudly to be recognized. And as the officer stepped inside alongside a representative from Robert's office, everything that had been uncertain the night before became structured, formal, and unavoidable. Vanessa was the first to react, her composure breaking not into chaos, but into urgency, her words coming quickly now, layered with explanations and attempts to regain control, but they no longer had the same effect, because this was no longer a conversation between family members, it was a documented situation moving through a defined process. I stood where I was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present as the documents were presented again, this time not as discussion, but as record, outlining the attempted transfer, the inconsistencies, the alterations that had already been verified and logged, and the consequences that followed from those actions. Michael looked from the papers to Vanessa and back again, and I saw the moment it settled in fully, the realization that this was not a misunderstanding that could be talked through, not something that could be smoothed over with the right words, but something that had already moved beyond their control entirely. When the officer explained the next steps, his tone calm and procedural, there was no room left for negotiation, and Vanessa's responses, which had once carried certainty, now felt scattered, incomplete, unable to anchor to anything solid. Michael did not speak again for a long moment, and when he finally did, it was not to argue, it was to ask a question that no longer had the power to change anything, because the outcome had already been set into motion long before he realized it. I stepped forward then, not to interrupt, but to conclude, placing my hand lightly on the edge of the table where everything had started weeks ago, and I looked at him, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity, the kind that comes when you no longer need anything from the person standing in front of you. I told him calmly and without hesitation that the house had always been mine, that nothing they had done had changed that, and that the only thing that had truly shifted was my understanding of who I was dealing with. I reminded him that I had not argued when the door was closed, that I had not forced my way back in, because I had chosen to let them believe something that was never true, and that one night had been all it took for everything they built on that belief to collapse. The officers proceeded with what needed to be done, not dramatically, not forcefully, just steadily, as the situation resolved itself in a way that left no doubt about what would follow, and as Vanessa was escorted out, still trying to piece together a version of events that would hold, there was nothing left for her to hold on to. Michael stood there, silent now, the certainty he had carried the night before completely gone, replaced by something far quieter, far heavier, and I did not need to say anything more to him, because the lesson had already been delivered in full. By the time the door closed again, this time under my control, the house felt different, not because anything physical had changed, but because the weight that had been placed on it had been removed entirely. I walked through each room slowly, not searching, not checking, just reclaiming step by step, until I reached the front door once more, the same door that had been closed on me less than 24 hours earlier, and I placed my hand on the lock, turning it with a steady, deliberate motion that carried none of the hesitation from the night before. I did not rush to speak, I did not need to raise my voice, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear, and as I stood there, the quiet settling around me once again, I allowed myself a single final thought, one that carried more weight than anything I could have said out loud, because in the end, they had not taken anything from me at all, they had simply shown me exactly who they were, and that had given me everything I needed to take it all back, completely, permanently, and on my terms.